Buzzards Bay, I think sounds very ominous to people who aren't from New England or aren't familiar with the area. But it's a large body of water, an important body of water in Massachusetts, and it's really beautiful. It's sort of a lot of people, I think, connect it also with the sort of the summer idyls, and it's got a to me a sort of romantic bend, but it sounds quite ominous, doesn't it? And it's a big, beautiful bay down in southern Massachusetts, and there's a lot of interesting history there. And in my book, The House on Buzzards Bay, we're looking at this very old, large, rambling house on the shores of the bay. And it's in this town we've kind of fictionalized and called it Patuxent, but it's based again on a version of my hometown in Wareham, Massachusetts, where 100 years ago, a little more, there were communities of spiritualists who would come down mostly from Boston, and they were searchers and seekers, and they were coming down to this land because they believed it had a particular spiritual connection, and they they built these structures down in this town because they wanted to communicate with the dead. That's what they were after. Like they were looking for ghosts, the dead, to sort of cross over to another plane in some fashion. And so today, this town has a lot of the remnants of that movement still around, that Victorian architecture and these crumbling old beautiful seaside homes. And so the house on Buzzards Bay, our house, is kind of was the original foothold of this spiritualist community down in our fictionalized Patuxent, Massachusetts. And now there's a group of old college friends who haven't seen each other in a very long time, and they're convening at this house for the first time in years. And it was a fun landscape to write about, and I like that setup of friends reuniting kind of on the beach. Our narrator here is Jim, and he's the owner of this big old rambling house that's been passed down and down and down through his family, and sort of by the vagaries of time and luck, it's ended up in his hands, or maybe misfortune in some regards too, but it's ended up in his hands. And when he inherited it, he was still in his 20s, and he didn't have any family left, any immediate family. And his friends were very important. He was living in New York, so he decided to sort of gift each of them a sliver of that land, a little piece of a co-op he had invented to make this land to belong to all of his friends. And it was kind of a scheme to get his friends to just come with him on weekends and vacations away. And for a long time, that was part of their life. There was his closest friends in the world, and they would all come to this beach house together. And then later in life, the way that happens, you all go off, you move away, you have different jobs, you have families, and maybe you've lost those old summer habits. But as luck would have it, this summer, everybody's coming back together in the same span of a couple of weeks. They're all going to stay under one roof together for the first time in ages. And with him is his wife, Valentina, who's a law professor, and his closest friends, Rami and Bruce. And Bruce is a very successful writer who none of them have seen in a while. And there's Maya and Shannon, who are coming from the Hudson Valley. And they're all descending on this house on Buzzards Bay. And it's going to stir up a lot of their old, when you see your friends that you haven't seen in a while, at least Jim, he's desperate to get back on the old footing and to feel that kind of old intimacy of friendship, but it doesn't quite feel the same as it used to. And I think that's kind of it's a common experience. I don't know. A lot of people always say, I see those old friends and it's like no time has passed at all. And I've never quite felt that way when I see my old friends. I feel that passage of time, and sometimes it weighs on me when I can't quite get back to that intimacy that we'd had once. So there's a break-in at the beginning of the story where some teenagers who are squatting in different houses around town, or somebody, we'll find out later who it is, has been in their house and has been kind of living there before they arrived. And then there's another form of guests that are arrived. So one of the friends, I won't say which one, somebody disappears fairly early on in the book, and the other characters go on staying at this house, and in the place of the person who's disappeared shows up a young French woman who's kind of vaguely seductive for all of these friends, and her presence kind of throws everything off kilter and begins tearing at the seams of these friendships and kind of their sense of reality too, because you have to remember, a house that was built to communicate with other planes. So they are this isn't a quiet house. This is the kind of house that groans and moans at night and makes a lot of strange noises, and animals come in off the salt marsh to visit them. And it's there's a lot of activity in this house, and I think all of the characters kind of quickly become they start to realize that they're not exactly sure what's real and what's not. I love them all, but there's a character named Rami who is kind of a fictionalized version of a very close friend of mine. And it's funny because when I write, I tend to take as a starting point real people who are very dear in my life. And then I use all of their attributes and all of the things I love about them, and then I make them do horrible things to one another because this is a mystery novel. And I do feel guilty and a little, I probably am creating a strange impression for a lot of people who do actually know my friends and family because I just make them do all these twisted things to one another. But there's a character, Rami, who is a diplomat working around mostly Central Europe at that moment. And he he's coming for the first time in a long while back to the States, and he and our narrator Jim have a very kind of special and confiding relationship. But also, Rami really loves Jim's wife in a very, specific, and there's a long-standing but different and distinct friendship between him and our narrator and him and our in the narrator's wife. And a lot of those dynamics are built off of a real friend of mine. And we had this kind of strange experience with a friend where my wife and I were at a wedding, seeing a lot of college friends for the first time. We were up in the mountains of France, and after one night, we were going back to the cabin we had rented, and we were walking alongside this guy who had been one of my closest friends in the world for a very long time. And as we were walking up this little mountain path next to a ravine, he suddenly fell to the ground and had an overwhelming panic attack. And when he finally got himself up and kind of dusted himself off, he explained to us that he had suddenly become overwhelmed with the certainty that we had brought him there to kill him. And he couldn't explain it. He didn't know why. He knows us. He knows that we weren't there to kill him, but he had just become convinced in that moment that we were murdering him. And that really stuck with me because that's such a strange thing to hear from such a close friend, right? I couldn't imagine what energy my wife and I were putting out into the world that anyone could think this of us, but he had in that moment. And so I sort of took some of that feeling, that uncanniness and the suspicion and the strangeness, and I put that into our story. And so that was kind of one of the beginnings of this story. So I've always had a special fondness for the Rami character who's the one who had this strange epiphany on a mountain. So I read this thing, this Elmore Leonard adage a long time ago that the way he introduces a character is he brings them into the story, and then he finds out if they can talk, if they can tell a story. And if they can talk a bit and keep your interest, he gives them a little more to do. And if they can't, then he kills them and they're gone, right? And I always like that as a sort of criterion for your characters. Can they maintain an interesting conversation? So I really depend on that in trying to find these characters and what they're going to do in the story. So I just throw them into a lot of conversations. I love chatty, talky novels and movies where people are just walk down the street in an interesting conversation between two people who can tell a story. That's my sweet spot. So I always think of these characters. Could they sit down in a bar or a restaurant and order a drink and hold a stranger's attention for 20 minutes kind of and tell them an interesting story about something odd that's been happening in their life recently. And so that for me, that's the big criterion when I'm seeing what these characters are going to do in a story. So I had an idea of who all these characters would be, but then you really discover more by just letting them talk to each other and try to tell stories and surprise one another.